Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson. We're continuing our study of the Thessalonian correspondence, and we're in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, and we're going to finish chapter 4 today. We're going to look at verses 13 through 18. So, he's just talked about the fact that Timothy has returned with good news about their progress. Even though Paul was only able to spend a few weeks with them. And this congregation is literally less than 6 months old. And we've talked about how strongly he taught from the very beginning of his preaching in this town, taught the second coming. In fact, he mentions the second coming in chapter 1, verse 3, chapter 1, verse 10, chapter 2, verse 19, 3:13, 4:15, 4:16, 5:2, 5:3, and 5:23. And of course, it's going to be a major topic in the follow-up letter, which is sent shortly after this letter, 2 Thessalonians. And he's going to get right to that point in chapter 1 of 2 Thessalonians. So he's imprinted on their brains that Jesus is coming, and that we have to be prepared, and that he's coming like a thief, and they understand that. So they sent a question back with Timothy, and they need an answer in writing, and I'm sure Timothy was able to answer this question, but they need to hear it from the Apostle Paul. And the question seems to be, from the answer that Paul gives, if someone dies before Jesus comes again, are they excluded from the resurrection? Now, Paul is going to write about this later on in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. But Jesus has already spoken on this subject, Matthew chapters 24 and 25, and given a pretty clear description of things that are going to happen when he comes again. And Jesus begins in 24 verse 36 by saying, no one knows when it's going to be, not the angels in heaven, not even me. Only the Father alone knows when the second coming is going to be. And what Paul writes is very much consistent with what Jesus has to say in Matthew chapters 24 and 25. And Jesus describes the judgment beginning with the saints being gathered up off the earth and being separated from those who have rejected the gospel, who remain on the earth. And there's a great gathering and a separation, one taken, the other left, is the refrain Jesus repeats there in Matthew chapter 24, verses 36 and following. And then he describes the judgment scene in chapter 25. And the Apostle Paul describes the same sort of gathering, although the emphasis is not separation, the emphasis is reunion. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is going to talk in great detail about our resurrection bodies and about the fact that we are going to be raised incorruptible, and he describes that here as well. So they want to know, if you die before Jesus comes, does that mean that you're not going to participate in the kingdom? And Paul's answer is no, the dead in Christ shall rise first. So let's read verses 13 through 18. We do not want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as do the rest who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus. For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord shall not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, with a trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord. Therefore, comfort one another with these words. He's going to continue talking about the implications of the second coming in chapter 5. But the fact of it is communicated here at the end of chapter 4. And he describes first a resurrection of the dead, of the just who are dead. And he never uses the word dead. He uses the word fallen asleep. And that's on purpose. I mean, that's a carefully chosen word, because sleep is not final and sleep is sweet. And that's how he describes the rest that that the deceased saints are having until that moment of resurrection. It's an instant. It happens in an instant, and Peter describes it that way as well. And both Peter and the book and John in Revelation and Paul describe this sound, this loud noise, the trumpet. The trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, he says in 1 Corinthians 15. The voice of the archangel, and so we begin with this sound, and then there is a resurrection. Jesus is going to be visible as being above us, not on earth, and then we who are alive and remain will join those saints and Jesus and never be parted again. Of course, we have to reconcile this with Matthew 25, the great judgment where people are parted on the right and the left. John also describes a judgment scene very much like this in Revelation chapter 21. So just because even as we stand in judgment, right and left, we're still there with the Lord, so we're not parted from each other, because all the saints are gathered together, and we're not parted from him because he's right there, and we're in his presence. And so there's no trouble reconciling those things. So Paul has answered their question, will the dead be excluded when Jesus... No. They'll be the first to join the Lord in the air. He'll talk about the implications for our daily life of this resurrection and this great reunion, and we'll talk about that next time. Before I close, though, verse 18, now therefore comfort one another with these words. Whenever I've heard someone say, the words don't exist that you're supposed to say when someone passes. Well, we do have the words that Jesus told us to say, and Paul told us to say. And they're right here in 1 Thessalonians. These are the words of comfort we give to each other. And I never do a funeral service for a brother or sister in Christ that I do not read these words, because I've been given the commission to read them, the responsibility to read them, and to offer this comfort. We'll pick up with chapter 5, verse 1 next time. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word.